Now available in paperback and e-readers. Isis, Bride of Dracula. The Goddess Next Door and John Haynes team up to take on the Dark Vampire in this action-packed Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Bride of Dracula in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers today. One of my viewers wanted to know why the marriage of Marvel characters Hank Pym and Janet Van Dyne failed in the comics. Now, your Henry Pym and Janet Van Dyne went by the code names Yellow Jacket and the Wasp at the time that their marriage failed in the pages of Marvel Comics' The Avengers. And both characters were founding members of the Avengers team, and they eventually wound up getting married in the pages of the Avengers. However, their marriage was destined to fail due to issues that your Henry Pym had as related to an inferiority complex that he had when he first joined the team. Now, your Henry Pym was a brilliant biochemist and scientist who had a lot of knowledge as related to his invention, the Pym particles. However, once he joined the Avengers and became part of the team with Iron Man, Thor, and the Incredible Hulk, and Captain America a few issues later, your Henry Pym was feeling extremely inadequate in the presence of more powerful heroes. Now, when your Henry Pym joined the Avengers, he was Ant-Man, and as Ant-Man, he felt incredibly small in comparison to characters like Iron Man, who had a powerful suit of armor, Thor, the Norse god from Asgard, and your Incredible Hulk, who was a gamma-powered super being with incredible strength, and your Captain America, a living legend. So your Henry Pym, feeling inadequate about himself, just felt like he couldn't measure up in terms of power to the other Avengers, and eventually he started to change his identity from being the Ant-Man to becoming the Giant Man. And as the Giant Man, he felt like he still could not measure up as part of the team, and eventually wound up leaving the team. Now, as your Henry Pym left the team, he was going on his own adventures and with the Wasp, and they were getting closer together as a couple. And then eventually they wound up returning to the Avengers when Henry Pym decided to take a more different growing formula and became Goliath, but this formula was extremely unstable, and this was the start of some issues as related to Henry Pym's mental health issues, because I believe that this formula wound up creating a chemical imbalance in his brain, which exacerbated his self-esteem problems as related to his inferiority complex. Now, this complex was further exacerbated by your Henry Pym as he was trying to go out here and get into robotics, and he created the robot Ultron. Now, the robot Ultron was based on Henry Pym's brain patterns, and once the robot Ultron wound up turning to look to destroy the Avengers and eventually humanity, this further led to a nervous breakdown that your Henry Pym had. Now, he wanted to say that the robot attacked him and wiped his memory, but I believe what happened here was your Henry Pym felt really bad about Ultron wanting to hurt other people, but the reason why the robot wanted to hurt people was because of his inferiority complex, because the robot had the same brain patterns that he had, and this was what I believe led to his nervous breakdown and him adopting the Yellow Jacket persona, and then the Yellow Jacket persona looking to coerce the Wasp into marrying her. And as this Yellow Jacket persona eventually broke away from Henry Pym's mind, your Jan decided to stay into the relationship with Henry Pym, and she decided to stay in the relationship with Henry Pym, knowing that he was dealing with a lot of mental health issues, and those mental health issues played over the course of 100 issues until they
basically hit a breaking point at about, I think, about issue 160 or so, because I have those books in my collection. And at that point, that's when your Henry Pym attacked the Avengers in a classic book with the cover Attacked by the Ant-Man, where his second or third nervous breakdown led to Jan revealing that your Henry Pym was dealing with serious mental health issues as related to the serum, the Goliath serum, and also his whole issues as related to Ultron. Now, all of this led to the Oedipus complex that Ultron had, and it was all based on Henry Pym's brain patterns, which showed that, again, your Henry Pym was deeply troubled, and he was deeply troubled because he never felt he could measure up as a hero and never felt like he could measure up as an Avenger. And even though he was instrumental in many battles, like the one against Count Nefaria and the one against Korvac, your Henry Pym was still struggling with issues, and those issues eventually came to a head towards the tail end of the Jim Shooter run of the Avengers. Now, many people want to say that your Henry Pym was a woman beater, but as someone who read the entire run of Jim Shooter stories, basically what Jim Shooter was trying to say was Henry Pym was struggling with a lot of mental health issues, and eventually his inferiority complex came to a head where he was looking to compromise his ethics in order to prove himself a hero. And during that time, your Henry Pym built a robot made out of adamantium to take on the Avengers, and he wanted to go out here and defeat this robot, but Jan found out all about it, and once she found out about it, she was trying to stop him, but the whole thing was your Henry Pym, because he was not in a good place mentally, he wound up backhanding her, and this is what led to the deterioration of their marriage. What happened was, when their marriage deteriorated, it was already falling apart because Henry Pym was simmering and boiling in anger and seething with rage because he felt he couldn't measure up as a hero, and he was acting emotionally and impulsively at the time, and he was about to be tried by the Avengers for attacking the Elf Queen, I believe. And what happened was he was about to be tried for this, and that's where he came up with the scheme with the robot. And once he came up with the scheme with the robot and attacked his wife unconsciously, what was happened was this is what led to Jan saying enough was enough and deciding to divorce your Henry Pym. Now, as somebody who has read the comics and read Jim Shooter's blog, I can agree with him that your Henry Pym was not a woman beater. He was a man who was deeply troubled for many years. He was a man who was dealing with mental health issues as related to the chemical imbalance in his brain due to taking an unstable serum, which further exacerbated his inferiority complex, and also dealing with issues as related to guilt for creating Ultron, which had his brain patterns. And as a result of all of this, everything led to him going out here and striking his wife out of this desperation that he had. And he wound up going out here and looking to try to be the hero. Unfortunately, he wasn't the hero, and he wound up going out in a very bad fashion, where he wound up getting arrested, where he wound up in jail, and eventually wound up and with one of his arch enemies, Egghead, forming a new Masters of Evil and looking to set him up to basically take Henry Pym out. But the Avengers stayed with their friend, and they still had his back, and even Jan had his back, knowing that he was still deeply troubled. And again, their marriage failed primarily due to Henry Pym's insecurities and feelings of inadequacy, and that is the main reason why their marriage wound up failing. Jan tried to stay with Hank all throughout their marriage for years and tried to help him deal with his numerous issues as related to his inferiority complex, this is the reason why he adopted so many different identities, such as Ant-Man, Giant Man, and Yellow Jacket, and Goliath. He adopted all of these different identities because he just felt he couldn't measure up as a hero, and he wanted to be able to be powerful. But the problem was he didn't see the power came from within. Now, your Henry Pym and Janet Pym, their marriage basically again fell apart. But the other reason why Jim Shooter, I believe, did this story was because he wanted to show the impact of divorce on superheroes, and he wanted to show how superheroes have to deal with human problems. And divorce was a major trend in the 70s, along with alcoholism. And the Demon in a Bottle storyline really helped a lot of kids who were dealing with alcoholic parents and people in their lives who had alcohol. And I remember reading the letters page, the printed circuits of Iron Man, and the impact that that story had on a lot of kids who were dealing with alcoholic parents and alcoholic family members. And this Avengers story also helped a lot of kids deal with divorce, because a lot of kids were coming from homes with divorce, and help them understand that the issues people have sometimes leads to their marriage falling apart. And this marriage again failed because, Jan tried to do everything in her power to stay with Hank, but once things got to the point where Hank was lost so much control, there was nothing else she could do. Now, as I'm reading that run later on, I saw why Jan was changing her hair and why she was putting on different hairstyles and different outfits, because she was trying to cope with the divorce. And guys like Tony Stark were looking to try to mac Jan, but Steve Rogers thankfully stopped Tony from making a mistake that would have really derailed the team by telling Tony not to date Jan. But Jan was trying to deal with the divorce, and your Hank was further falling apart. And this was shown in issues of West Coast Avengers, where your Henry Pym, in the face of all of his numerous issues, eventually wound up hitting rock bottom when he wound up attempting suicide. Now, Henry Pym, after he had wound up being tried for the case and dealt with the Masters of Evil, retired as a superhero, and then eventually went and got a job as the caretaker of the West Coast Avengers compound. And it's when he came to the West Coast Avengers compound that he finally started dealing with many of his issues. And I believe Jim Shooter, who was still working at Marvel, again wanted to show how a divorce affects a person and how they have all of these numerous issues, but eventually they have to go out here and start dealing with those issues. He showed Jan going out here and taking her power by becoming the leader of the Avengers, but he showed Henry Pym eventually coming into his own by realizing that it wasn't the costumes that made him a hero, it was himself that made him a hero. Because during that time, your Henry Pym started wearing just this red jumpsuit with pockets all over it, and had all of these different inventions inside of it. And this is where he started to learn how to become a hero without a costume and a mask. And he eventually wound up starting to rediscover his own worth and his own value. And this is where he wound up breaking free of the inferiority complex that he had, and he wound up dealing with a lot of the issues that he had as related to the death of his first wife, his failed relationship with Jan, and he wound up also dealing with the fact that he didn't have confidence back then, but he found new confidence once he just put on that red jumpsuit and was Henry Pym. So this is where he started to regain his confidence. And Jim Shooter had left Marvel at that point, and writer John Byrne was looking to try to reconcile Hank and Jan's relationship. And as John Byrne, during the Vision Quest, was out here messing with the Vision and Scarlet Witch's marriage, he was really putting Hank and Jan back together as characters. And if he had stayed with the book, he possibly would have brought them back together, but they wound up becoming apart in the West Coast Avengers, and eventually reconciled their relationship and decided to just be friends, even though they were friends with benefits in numerous issues of books that I read in the late 80s and the early 90s. And your Kurt Busiek further developed their characters in the classic story Ultron Unlimited. Now, Ultron Unlimited is a masterpiece of a story because this is the story where Henry Pym eventually becomes full circle, realizes that he, even though Ultron's brain patterns were based on his, he eventually winds up confronting the nightmare of Ultron and eventually winds up confronting everything that led to him winding up with his life falling apart. So that was a classic story. And again, this is a character transformation arc that's an overreaching arc. And this overreaching arc eventually led to your Henry Pym and Janet Van Dyne coming full circle. And they were really good characters together. But when they fell apart, we saw these characters grow. We saw those characters change, and eventually we saw them starting to come back together. And I think that they would be better back together. Unfortunately, Marvel has gone in a different direction. Your Henry Pym wound up getting involved with your Greer Nelson, Tigra, and he's a baby daddy by Tigra, which is something that I felt was a bit out of character because Greer was a feminist, and this really didn't really fit her character, but that's the direction Marvel went in, and now he's a baby daddy to Greer Nelson, and they have a child, so I don't know if Hank and Jan could get back together. Jan's character is now mentoring Henry Pym's daughter, the Wasp, and recently I found out that Henry Pym is supposedly dead, and he was merged with Ultron, which was a really horrible storyline. But them coming back together could possibly be done by a very good writer like a Kurt Busiek or one of these other really good writers like Chip Zdarsky. And there's a possibility that they could come back together because there were other creators like John Byrne and Kurt Busiek who were trying to reconcile Hank and Jan's marriage and reconcile their relationship, because when it comes down to people, yes, people change and grow, but if people love each other, they will eventually grow and come back together. So it's never over until it's over, and that could be the case with Henry Pym and Janet Van Dyne. If they had a good writer, there's a possibility of bringing them back together, and I really want to see a good writer approach these characters, because so many bad writers come out here and say, oh, Henry Pym is a woman beater. Henry Pym was not a woman beater. A woman beater abuses women in multiple relationships, and every one of their paradigms eventually ends in abuse. And your Henry Pym was not a woman beater. He was a deeply troubled man who was desperate and wound up wanting to try to be a hero, and ironically it was his quest to be a hero that led to him going down the villain's road. And the whole thing is that Henry Pym was not a woman beater. Anyone who understands a domestic abuser understands that they do this to every partner that they get involved with. So when I look at the whole case of Henry Pym, again, his marriage only failed because he had an inferiority complex. He didn't feel like he was worthy of being the scientist and the hero that he was. And that's why everything fell apart, because he didn't feel like he was worth it. But once he felt like he was worth it and got his self-esteem back up, he, I believe, would go back to being a hero and possibly wind up going back to be a husband. It just takes one good writer to put Henry Pym and Jan back together and bring back one of Marvel's great super couples. Now, this was a video requested by one of my viewers, and if you want to request a video, you can send a donation to the Patreon, the PayPal, or the Cash App, and if I know something about that subject, I will make that video for you. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.
Now available in paperback and e-readers, E-Steam Horror of the Hyena Woman. Hell's aspiring angel takes on a wicked werewolf in this action-packed all-new E-Steam series adventure. Get E-Steam Horror of the Hyena Woman in paperback and e-readers today.